Have you ever had someone look you straight in the eye and say something so cold, so confident, that they expected it to break you? That's exactly what happened to me. One ordinary Tuesday night, my wife smiled, crossed her arms, and said, "If I wanted to, I could replace you within 24 hours. She wasn't angry. She wasn't joking. She wanted to see me crack. Most people would have argued. Some would have yelled. Others would have started begging for reassurance. I did something she never expected. I stayed completely silent. And in that silence, I watched the confidence slowly disappear from her face. What happened over the next few minutes changed the entire direction of our marriage. Not because I won an argument, but because I stopped playing the game she'd been playing for years. Before I tell you what happened, let me explain something. Rachel wasn't a bad person. She was smart, successful, funny, and the kind of woman who could walk into any room and instantly become the center of attention. That confidence was one of the reasons I fell in love with her. But somewhere along the way, confidence slowly turned into control. Little comments became daily habits. Every disagreement became a competition. Every conversation felt like someone had to win. At first, I fought back. Then I defended myself. Eventually, I just got tired. What Rachel didn't realize was that over the years, I wasn't becoming weaker. I was learning something far more dangerous. I was learning when not to react. And that lesson was about to catch her completely off guard. Because the words she was about to say would end with an answer she never saw coming. But before I tell you what I said, you need to hear the exact moment she made the boldest claim she'd ever made. It all started after dinner. The dishes were still sitting in the sink. The TV was playing quietly in the background, and I was flipping through the pages of a novel I'd already read twice. Nothing about that evening felt unusual, until Rachel broke the silence. She looked up from her phone with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You know something?" she said. I glanced over. "What?" She leaned back on the couch, folded her arms, and said it as casually as if she were talking about the weather. "If I wanted to, I could have someone else by tomorrow." For a second, the room felt strangely quiet. Not because of what she said, but because I knew exactly why she said it. This wasn't a confession. It wasn't even a threat. It was a test. Rachel had always believed that emotions gave her the upper hand. If I got jealous, she won. If I got angry, she won. If I started defending myself, she definitely won. She expected one of those reactions. Instead, I slowly closed my book and placed it on the coffee table. I looked her directly in the eyes, and I smiled. Not a sarcastic smile. Not an angry one. Just calm. That caught her off guard immediately. She blinked. "That's it?" she asked. "You're not going to say anything?" I shrugged. "What exactly do you want me to say?" For the first time that night, her confidence cracked ever so slightly. She laughed, but it sounded forced. "Oh, come on," she said. "You're telling me that doesn't bother you?" I took a slow breath before answering. "It tells me a lot," I said. "Just probably not what you hoped." The smile disappeared from her face. She had expected me to defend my place in her life. Instead, I questioned why she needed to make that statement in the first place. And suddenly, she wasn't the one asking the questions anymore. She was the one searching for answers. What I said next wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But those few quiet words completely shifted the balance of power, and she never saw them coming. Rachel stared at me for a moment, waiting. She was convinced I was about to snap. Instead, I simply asked, "Can I ask you something?" She nodded, almost impatiently. "If you really believe someone can replace me in 24 hours. I paused. "What does that say about the relationship we've spent years building?" She frowned. "That's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" For the first time since the conversation started, she didn't have an immediate answer. She looked away for a second before saying, "I just mean, people move on. Nobody's irreplaceable." I nodded slowly. "You're right. That wasn't the response she expected." She raised an eyebrow. "I am? Absolutely. No one is irreplaceable." I leaned back in my chair. "But respect is." She stayed quiet. "So is trust." Another few seconds passed. And once those disappear, I looked directly at her. It doesn't matter who's standing beside you. The room fell silent. I wasn't trying to hurt her. I wasn't trying to prove I was better. I was simply saying something she hadn't considered. Replacing a person is easy. Replacing years of shared memories. Inside jokes no one else understands. Late night conversations. The moments that quietly build a life together. That's a completely different story. You can meet someone new overnight, but you can't recreate history. Rachel folded her arms again. This time, it wasn't confidence. It looked more like discomfort. So, she asked quietly, "You really wouldn't fight for me?" I smiled. "I'd fight for a healthy marriage." I paused. "But I won't compete with imaginary people just to convince someone of my worth." Those words landed harder than I expected. She looked at me as if she was seeing a different man. Not because I'd changed overnight, but because I'd finally stopped reacting the way she expected. And once someone realizes they can no longer control your emotions, they suddenly lose confidence in controlling the conversation. That's exactly what was happening. For the first time in years, Rachel had no idea what to say next. Then she asked me one question. A question that sounded simple, but my answer would completely change the rest of the night. Rachel finally broke the silence. Her voice was quieter now. "So let me get this straight. If I actually walked away tomorrow," she searched my face, "you'd just let me go?" I didn't answer immediately. Not because I didn't know what to say, because some questions deserve a thoughtful answer. "I'd be devastated," I admitted. "I've spent years building a life with you. Of course it would hurt." For a split second, she looked relieved. Almost like she'd finally found the emotional reaction she'd been looking for. But then I continued. "Being hurt isn't the same as begging someone to stay." Her expression froze. "I love you, Rachel. I always have. But love without mutual respect eventually turns into exhaustion." She looked down at the coffee table, tracing the rim of her coffee mug with her finger. "You really think I don't respect you?" "I think," I replied carefully, "that sometimes you confuse being right with being respected." The room went completely still. She opened her mouth to argue, then stopped. Because deep down, she knew exactly what I meant. For years, every disagreement had followed the same script. She'd make a sharp comment. I'd defend myself. She'd push harder. I'd react emotionally. And somehow, the real issue always disappeared beneath the argument itself. Tonight was different. There was nothing to push against. No raised voice. No anger. No desperate attempt to prove my value. Just calm honesty. That's what made this conversation feel so uncomfortable. Not for me. For her. People expect resistance. They know how to fight resistance. But honesty, delivered calmly, leaves very little room to hide. Rachel looked at me for several long seconds. Then she asked something I'd never heard her ask before. "When did you change?" I smiled. "I didn't. I just stopped giving my peace away every time someone challenged it." She lowered her eyes. And for the first time that evening, there wasn't any arrogance left in her voice. Only curiosity. Only reflection. Maybe even a little regret. Then she quietly admitted something she'd never admitted in our entire marriage. And hearing those words made me realize this conversation was no longer about winning an argument. Rachel took a slow breath. Then, almost in a whisper, she said something I never expected to hear. "I don't think I've ever seen you this calm." I gave a small smile. "Maybe because you've never stopped long enough to notice." She looked away. The confidence she'd carried into this conversation was gone. Instead, she seemed lost in her own thoughts. After a long pause, she finally spoke again. "You know, I honestly thought you'd get angry. I thought you'd accuse me of something. I thought we'd end up screaming at each other like we always do." I nodded. "I know. So why didn't you?" Because the truth was surprisingly simple. I realized something a long time ago. You can't build peace by constantly defending yourself. The more I tried to prove my worth, the less I actually felt it. She stared at me without saying a word. So I stopped trying. I stopped arguing over every comment. I stopped chasing approval. And I started asking myself one question. I leaned forward slightly. Why am I working so hard to convince someone of my value when I should already know it? That question changed everything. Not overnight. Not in a dramatic movie moment. Little by little, it changed the way I walked into conversations. It changed the way I handled conflict. Most importantly, it changed the way I saw myself. Rachel's eyes filled with emotion. Not tears, just realization. I guess she hesitated. "I've spent a long time testing you." I nodded again. "I know. And you never thought about leaving?" For the first time that evening, I answered without hesitation. I thought about leaving the constant conflict, but I never wanted to leave you. "There's a difference." Her shoulders dropped, almost as if she had been carrying an invisible weight all along. She looked around the quiet living room before meeting my eyes again. I'm not sure I knew the difference. That sentence hit harder than every bold claim she'd made earlier, because it wasn't spoken from pride. It came from honesty. And honesty has a way of changing conversations that arguments never can. In that moment, neither of us was trying to win anymore. We were finally listening. But before the night was over, I said one final thing, a single sentence that stayed with Rachel long after the conversation ended and completely changed the way we looked at our marriage. Neither of us spoke for a while. The silence felt different now. It wasn't cold. It wasn't tense. For the first time in years, it felt honest. I stood up, picked up my coffee mug, and walked toward the kitchen. Before I reached the doorway, Rachel quietly called my name. Wait, I turned around. She looked at me with an expression I'd almost forgotten. Not confidence, not frustration, just sincerity. I'm sorry. Those two words weren't dramatic. They didn't erase every mistake we'd ever made, but they were real. And sometimes, that's where healing begins. I walked back and sat down across from her. You don't have to be perfect, I said. Neither do I. But if we're going to keep building this marriage, we have to stop treating each other like opponents. She nodded slowly. I think somewhere along the way, I started trying to win arguments instead of protecting our relationship. I smiled. I did the same thing, just in a different way. I kept trying to keep the peace instead of addressing the real problem. For the first time that night, we weren't blaming each other. We were taking responsibility. And that changed everything. Looking back now, I realized the biggest lesson had nothing to do with who could replace whom. It was about self-respect. Real confidence isn't proving you're better than someone else. It isn't making threats. It isn't controlling the conversation. Real confidence is staying true to yourself, even when someone expects you to lose your composure. Because the moment your peace depends on someone else's approval, you've already given away your power. That night, I didn't win because I had the perfect comeback. I won because I chose peace over pride, respect over ego, and understanding over reaction. Funny enough, that was the first conversation in years where neither of us walked away feeling defeated. We walked away understanding each other a little better. And maybe that's what a strong relationship is really about. Not finding someone who can never hurt you, but finding two people willing to grow after the hurt. If you've ever been in a situation where someone tried to shake your confidence, remember this. The strongest response isn't always the loudest one. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is stay calm, know your worth, and refuse to let someone else define it for you. If this story made you think, let me know in the comments. What would you have said if someone told you they could replace you in 24 hours? I'd genuinely like to hear your answer. And if you enjoy real-life stories about relationships, self-respect, and personal growth, don't forget to subscribe, because the next story might change the way you see difficult conversations forever.